You will sign here, Alaric said, and slid the marriage settlement across the table without once lifting his eyes to the woman he was about to marry. And we will neither of us pretend this is anything but a debt discharged. The pen scratched. The candle guttered. And the Duke of Rookhurst, who had wanted nothing in the world so little as a wife, watched a slim-gloved hand write the name he would be bound to for the rest of his life, Marisol, and felt the last door of his own choosing close quietly behind him. He did not look at her face. That was the beginning of it, though he did not know then that it was a beginning of anything but ruin. He looked at the paper, and at the seal, and at his own signature already drying above hers, and he thought of his father in the ground 3 months, and of the letter his father had left behind, and of the way a man could be sold by the dead as neatly as by the living. The great library of Rookhurst was cold that November. It was always cold. Alaric had let it grow cold on purpose, the way a man lets a wound stay open so that he will not forget it is there. His father's book-lined domain, his father's chair, his father's clock ticking on the mantel with the same maddening patience it had ticked all through Alaric's boyhood, counting out the hours in which a boy had waited to be loved and had learned, instead, to be useful. Across the table the girl folded her hands. She was not truly a girl. She was 23, he had been told, only 7 years younger than himself, but she seemed young to him, and something in her stillness offended him, as if she had no right to be calm on the evening she had helped ruin his life. "Is there anything," Marisol Vane asked, "that you would have me understand?" Her voice was low and even. That, too, offended him. "There is nothing to understand," he said. "You are the daughter of a merchant. Your father held £6,000 of my father's debt and a mortgage on the North Farms, and rather than see the estate broken up, my father promised him what such men always want, a title for his blood. You are the price. I am the goods. There. Now you understand everything, and we need not speak of again." He had meant it to wound. He watched to see it land, but she only inclined her head, as though he had told her the hour, and said, "Thank you for your plainness, your grace. I have found that plainness, however cold, is kinder in the end than kindness that is false." And she rose and curtsied and left the library, and Alaric sat alone with the clock and the guttering candle and a fury he could not name, because he had wanted her to weep or to plead, or to show herself grasping and vulgar so that he might hate her cleanly, and she had given him nothing to hate but her composure. He hated that most of all. They were married 11 days later in the chapel at Rookhurst, with the frost thick on the lead-paned windows and the vicar's breath smoking in the cold. There were perhaps 20 guests. The county had come to look, not to celebrate. Alaric could feel their eyes on the back of his neck through the whole of the service, the eyes of people who had known his mother, who remembered what the Rookhurst dukes had been, who had come to see the last of that great old blood-spliced to a wool merchant's daughter because the young duke had gambled, no, because the old duke had gambled and lost and left his son to pay. That was the injustice of it, and Alaric held it against her because she was the only living creature he could hold it against. His father was dead. His father's creditors were faceless. But here beside him at the altar stood a woman in a grey silk gown, veiled, her hand resting light as ash on his sleeve, and she was near enough to blame. "I, Alaric Rookhurst, take thee, Marisol," he said, and heard his own voice come out flat and hard as a struck coin. "I, Marisol, take thee, Alaric," she answered, and her voice did not tremble, and he thought, "She is glad, she has climbed. A merchant's daughter is a duchess now, and she is glad, and she has cost me everything, and she is glad." He was wrong about that. He would spend a year being wrong about it. But that day he did not know he was wrong, and a man who does not know he is wrong is the cruelest creature God makes. He did not kiss her. When the vicar's benediction ended and the small congregation stirred, Alaric took his bride's hand and led her down the aisle at arm's length, correct as a statue, and outside on the frozen chapel steps, before he handed her up into the carriage that would carry them the half-mile to the great house. He said the thing that set the shape of their first year. "We are married," he said, "because the law and my father's folly require it. I will not touch you. I will not humiliate you before the servants. You will have your rooms, your allowance, your establishment. You will be the Duchess of Rookhurst in every particular that the world can see. But you will not mistake civility for affection, madam. I did not choose you. I will never choose you. I want you to be quite clear on that point so that you are not disappointed later. She looked up at him. He had not, until that moment, truly looked at her either. He had kept his eyes at a careful middle distance for 11 days. And so it startled him a little to find that her eyes were grey, a clear pale grey like water over slate, and that they held not the wounded look he expected nor the grasping one he had assigned to her, but something steadier and harder to bear, understanding. I am not disappointed, Your Grace, she said. One cannot be disappointed of a thing one never hoped for. And she gathered her skirts and climbed into the carriage without his help, and Alaric stood a moment on the steps with the wind cutting through his coat, feeling absurdly, he told himself, as though he had lost some contest he had not known he was playing. So began the marriage of the Duke of Rookhurst and his Duchess, a marriage in name, a treaty between strangers, a house divided down its long cold middle. She kept to the east wing, he kept to the west. They met at dinner, because the servants would talk if they did not. And at dinner they spoke of the weather, of the tenants, of the price of wool. She knew a great deal about the price of wool, and it galled him that her knowledge was often more useful than his own, and of nothing that touched the heart. He gave her the correct half of his attention and no more. He was scrupulously, murderously polite, and through the winter and into the spring he watched her, sidelong, the way one watches a fire one does not trust, waiting for her to show the greed he was certain lay under the grey silk. He waited for her to overspend her allowance, and she underspent it. He waited for her to fill his house with her merchant relations, and she invited no one at all. Her father, he learned, she saw twice a year and no oftener, and of the visits she said nothing. He waited for her to lord her new rank over the servants, and instead the servants began, he noticed it slowly, and it irritated him, to love her. It began with old Mrs. Penhale, the housekeeper, who had served 3 dukes and feared none of them, and who took to speaking of her grace in a warm changed voice that Alaric had never once heard her use of him. It spread to the kitchens, where the cook sent up the Duchess's favourite dishes unbidden, to the stables, where the grooms touched their caps to her with real feeling, to the tenants who, Alaric discovered, riding his own lands one raw March morning, knew their new Duchess by sight, because she walked out among them. Her Grace come to see my mother when she took the fever, a cottager's boy told him, not knowing to whom he spoke of the Duke's own wife, sat up 2 nights, brought broth and them powders from the town. Mother says she've an angel's hands. Alaric rode on without answering. An angel's hands. He thought it a piece of tenant flattery, the kind of thing simple people said of anyone who condescended to notice them. He did not go home and thank his wife. He went home and grew colder, because every proof of her goodness was a reproach to his certainty, and a man who has built his whole peace on a certainty will defend it against the truth like a dog defends a bone. He told himself she did it to win the county. He told himself she was clever, that a merchant's daughter would naturally understand that a reputation was a kind of stock to be traded up, that her kindness was an investment and nothing more. He told himself these things at dinner, watching her small grave face across the length of the table. And she said, "The Hartley's roof will not last the winter, Your Grace. I have asked Mr. Combe to see to it, if you have no objection." And he said, "As you like," in a voice like a closed door, and she inclined her head and ate her soup, and he hated her, and did not understand why hating her had begun to feel like hating himself. Spring turned. The great chestnuts along the Rookhurst Avenue put out their candles of blossom. And Alaric, who rode out most mornings to be away from the house that his marriage had made a prison, found that he could not, for all his riding, ride away from a single small fact that had lodged in him like a splinter. She was good. Whatever her reasons, however calculated, however he chose to explain it away, the woman he had married was good, and he had told her on the chapel steps that he would never choose her, and every day that she was good he felt the words grow heavier, until they hung about his neck like a stone. He did not know yet what to do with that weight. He was a proud man, and pride is patient. It can carry a great deal for a long time before it breaks. His would carry the stone for the better part of a year before the night that broke it. But the seed of that night was planted in the spring, on an evening he would remember for the rest of his life, without at first understanding why. He had come in late from the fields, mud to the knee, and passing the little chapel that stood apart from the house among the yews, he had seen a light in it, a single candle, low behind the frosted glass, and had thought some servant careless and had gone to put it out. He had not put it out. He had stopped at the chapel door, hearing a voice, and had not gone in. He did not that spring evening hear what she prayed. He heard only the shape of it, a woman's low voice, alone, unhurried, speaking to God in the empty dark as one speaks to an old friend. And he had turned and walked back to the house in the falling dusk with a strange unease in him, as of a man who has passed a door behind which something is happening that concerns him more than he knows. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she prayed for her father's soul, or for a fair spring, or for herself. He told himself he did not care what she prayed for. He was, as usual, wrong. But it would take him until autumn to find out how wrong, and a great deal of grief would fall between the spring evening and the autumn night, and the Duke of Rookhurst would have to lose almost everything he had refused to know he wanted before he learned, at last, to want it. The clock on the library mantel ticked on, the chestnuts dropped their blossom. And in her east wing alone, the Duchess of Rookhurst went on being good to a husband who would not look at her, and went on, night after night, into the little candlelit chapel among the yews, and knelt and prayed for what, and for whom Alaric did not yet know. The summer brought company to the county, and with company came Lady Sabina Merrow. Alaric had known her since they were children. Her father's estate marched with his along the eastern boundary, and there had been a time, before his own father's ruin, before the debts, before the grey-eyed merchant's daughter was thrust upon him, when the whole neighbourhood had spoken of Alaric Rookhurst and Sabina Merrow in a single breath, as of a thing settled. She was beautiful in the way the county understood beauty, dark, brilliant, quick, with a laugh that turned heads and a way of looking at a man as though he were the only door out of a dull room. She came to Rookhurst in July at the head of a party of the neighbouring gentry, ostensibly to admire the gardens, and she found the Duke on the terrace and gave him her hand and her dazzling smile, and said, low, so that his wife should not hear it across the lawn, "Poor Alaric, married to a ledger. I could weep for you." He should have rebuked her. A better man would have, but the wound in him was still open, still cold, and Sabina's pity was the first thing in 8 months that had agreed with his own private grief instead of reproaching it, and so he did not rebuke her. He let her walk with him. He let her murmur all afternoon the things he had been telling himself, that he had been cheated, that he had been sold, that a man of his blood ought never to have been yoked to trade, that it was a tragedy, a positive tragedy, and no fault of his that he could not love where he had not chosen. And across the lawn his wife moved among the guests in a gown of dove-grey muslin, pouring tea, remembering names, drawing out the shy and gently deflecting the rude. Being Alaric could not help but see it even through the flattering fog of Sabina's talk. A better hostess than the great house had known since his mother died. Old Colonel Fenwick, who was deaf and disliked everyone, sat an hour beside the Duchess and came away declaring her a sensible young woman. "Sir, a very sensible young woman, none of your simpering." The vicar's wife a censorious creature unbent to her. Even the children of the party, there were 2 or 3, brought along by fond mothers, drifted to Marisol as children drift to warmth, and she knelt on the grass in her good gown to look at a beetle one small boy had captured in his cupped hands, and Alaric, watching from the terrace with Sabina's dark head close to his shoulder, felt something turn over in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want one. "She has made herself very agreeable," Sabina said, following his gaze, and there was a fine edge under the honey of her voice. "One must give the girl that. Trade always does make itself agreeable. It is how trade survives. Whereas we Alaric, we of the old blood, we have the luxury of being true. Is it not so?" "It is so," he said. But he said it looking at his wife on the grass, and the words felt like a coin passed in the dark that he already suspected was counterfeit. That night at dinner, when the guests had gone, Marisol said to him quietly, "Lady Sabina Merrow is welcome at Rookhurst as often as you wish, your grace. I would not have you think I mind it." The composure of it undid him. He wanted, suddenly and violently, to make her mind it. "You presume to grant permission for my acquaintance in my own house." "No," she said, unruffled. "I only wished you to be easy. You seemed unhappy that she came." "I would not add to your unhappiness." And there it was again, that quiet, that maddening, unaskful kindness, offered to the very man who had told her on the chapel steps that he would never choose her, offered without hope of return, offered as one leaves out milk for a stray that hisses at the hand. He set down his glass hard enough that the wine leaped in it. "Do not," he said, "manage me, madam. I am not one of your father's clerks." Something crossed her grey eyes then, just once, just for a breath, the first crack he had ever seen in her, and she lowered them to her plate and said, "No, your grace, forgive me," and did not speak again through the whole of the meal. And he had won. He had wanted the crack and he had made it, and he sat in the ringing silence he had wanted and found it was ashes in his mouth. He rose before the covers were cleared and went to his cold library and drank alone, and told himself he was justified and did not believe himself and slept badly. That was the summer. Sabina came often after that. She had scented an opening, and Sabina Merrow had never in her life left an opening unpressed. She flattered him, walked with him, rode with him, arranged little dinners at her father's house to which the Duchess was pointedly and correctly invited, and at which the Duchess was pointedly and correctly ignored, so that the whole county might see how the wind sat and might carry the news of it from drawing-room to drawing-room. The Duke of Rookhurst regretted his marriage. The Duke of Rookhurst was seen everywhere with Lady Sabina, poor Lady Sabina who ought to have had him, and the little Duchess, the merchant's girl, who had climbed so high and now sat so alone. Alaric heard some of this and pretended he did not, and told himself it was Sabina's doing and none of his. But it was his. He knew, in the part of a man that always knows, that a wife's honour is her husband's to guard, and that he was letting his own be dragged through the county's gossip like a hem through mud, and that his wife bore all of it, the slights and the whispers and the empty place beside her at Sabina's cruel little dinners, with a straight back and a still face and never one word of complaint to him. Once only did he see what it cost her. He came upon her in the long gallery one grey August evening, alone, standing before the portrait of his mother, the beautiful, sad-eyed woman who had died when Alaric was 10. And Marisol did not hear him, and for a moment before she knew he was there he saw her face unguarded, and it was not composed at all. It was lonely. It was a loneliness so plain and so patiently borne that it stopped the breath in him, and she was looking up at the portrait of the dead Duchess as if asking the painted woman how one was to live in this house, how one was to go on being kind to stone. Then she heard his step and her face closed like a shutter, and she curtsied and said, "Your Grace," and moved to pass him, and he let her pass and said nothing, because he did not know what a man said who had just seen the ruin he was making of a good woman, and had no honest word to offer that was not an apology, and he was not ready, not yet, not for months yet, to apologize. But the picture of her lonely face stayed with him. It joined the shape of the prayer he had half heard in the spring, and the memory of her kneeling on the grass over a child's beetle, and the tenant boy's angel's hands, and old Fenwick's sensible young woman, and Mrs. Penhale's warm changed voice, all of it accumulating in him. Silt in a slow river, building toward a bank that must one day break. Autumn came early that year. The chestnuts turned. The mornings smoked with mist. The harvest came in thin, for it had been a wet, cold summer. And Alaric rode his lands with his steward and saw for himself that the tenants would suffer through the winter, and heard, everywhere he rode, the same refrain that he was by now too proud to acknowledge and too honest to disbelieve, that her Grace had been before him. Her Grace had ordered the doctor to old widow Nance and paid him from her own purse. Her Grace had bought the whole of the Prince's spoiled crop at full price, so the family should not starve, and had it carted away and burnt where none could see, so that no one need know their charity was charity. Her Grace had sat up, again, through another fever, another cottage, with another dying woman's hand in hers. "She'll wear herself to nothing, your Grace, if you'll pardon me," his steward said, an honest old man who had loved Alaric's mother. "She don't spare herself, out in all weathers." "And her not strong." "Not strong?" Alaric said, and was surprised by the sharpness of his own voice. "A weak chest, your Grace, so the maids say. She cause of a night. Begging your pardon, I'd have thought you'd know it." He had not known it. That was the shame of it, laid bare in a steward's kind, clumsy words. He had lived 11 months under the same roof as his wife, and did not know that she coughed at night, did not know her chest was weak, did not know the smallest true thing about the woman whose name he had signed above his own. He rode home in a black silence, and the black was no longer the black of anger. It had begun, without his leave, to be something worse. It had begun to be shame. Still he did nothing. Pride is patient. He told himself the steward exaggerated, that the maids gossiped, that a weak chest was a small thing. He avoided Sabina for a fortnight and could not have said why, and when she came to Rookhurst and found him cold, she pouted and probed and at last said, with the first real venom he had heard from her, "You are grown very dull, Alaric. One would almost think you were falling in love with your ledger after all," and he told her in a voice that surprised them both, that she would oblige him by not speaking of the Duchess in that manner in his house. Sabina's dark eyes narrowed. She said nothing then. But she was a woman who kept accounts, and she wrote that down in the ledger of her own, and Alaric would learn before the year was out that a scorned Sabina Merrow was a more dangerous creature than the merchant's daughter he had spent a year despising had ever been. It was late October when the thing happened that broke the bank at last. It had been raining for 3 days, a cold, hard, slanting rain, and on the 4th night the rain stopped and left the sky scoured and bitter with early frost, and Alaric, unable to sleep, unable to sit in his cold library with his cold thoughts, took a lantern and went out into the wet blue dark to walk, as he sometimes did, the length of the terrace and down through the wet gardens to the river and back, to tire his body because his mind would not tire. His path took him, as it had once in the spring, past the little chapel among the yews, and there again a light, a single candle low behind the frosted glass, and this time, God help him, he did not walk on, and he did not go in. This time he stopped at the half-open door, in the black shadow of the yews with his lantern shuttered, and he stood in the cold and the dripping dark, and he listened, and what he heard there, in his wife's low, unhurried voice, speaking to God alone in the empty candlelit dark, believing herself unheard by any living soul, what he heard there broke him open like a struck stone, and the man who walked back to the great house an hour later was not the man who had walked out. She was kneeling at the chapel rail, her plain grey shawl about her shoulders, her head bowed and her hands folded, and the one candle threw her shadow long and wavering up the old stone wall, and she was praying aloud in the way of a person who has prayed alone so long that the aloneness has ceased to be a barrier and become a kind of privacy. The way one speaks freely in an empty house, and for my father, she was saying, though he sold me, Lord, though he weighed his daughter against a debt and found the debt the heavier, keep him. He did not know how to love me. His own father did not teach him. Do not hold it against him. He gave me to a great house and thought he did me a kindness. Keep him, and let him not lie awake. Alaric stood very still in the dark of the yews. And for the tenants, she went on, low and steady, for the Prinns and old Nance, and the Hartley children, and all who will be called this winter, give me the means and the strength to do for them what I can, and let it be enough, and forgive me that it is never enough. And keep the widow Nance from pain in her last hour, for she is afraid, and I have promised to sit with her, and I do not know if I have the courage. A silence. The candle guttered and steadied. And for my husband, she said. Alaric's heart stopped in him. For Alaric, she said, his name in her mouth, spoken to God, spoken with a tenderness he had never once earned from her, and had certainly never earned in this. For Alaric, Lord above all, he is so unhappy. He has been unhappy so long since before I came. I did not make his sorrow, but I have not been able to lift it, and I would give the rest of my life to lift it if I knew the way. He thinks I hate him. He thinks I climbed to this house over his ruin and am glad of it, and there is no glad in me, Lord, there is only him, only the wish that he could be at peace, that he could sleep, that he could ride out one morning and see his own good fields and feel joy in them the way a man ought. He does not love me. I have long stopped hoping he ever will, but I am not asking you for his love. I am asking you for his happiness, and if his happiness is Lady Sabina, or another, or a life which I am only the shadow in the east wing that keeps his house and troubles him not at all, then give him that, Lord, give him that. Let him be happy, whatever it costs me. I ask nothing for myself. Only let him be happy, and let me be, in some small hidden way he need never know of, the means of it. The candle burned, the rain dripped from the black yews. And the Duke of Rookhurst stood outside the door of his own chapel with his hand pressed flat against the cold wet stone and his whole face wet, and he did not know when he had begun to weep, and he did not stop. For a year, for a whole cold year, he had told himself a story, and the story had been that she was grasping, that she was glad, that she had climbed over him and was content. He had built his justification upon it as a man builds a wall against the weather. And here, in the dark, in her own voice, believing herself unheard, she had put out one small candle flame of truth, and his whole wall had fallen. She was not glad. She had never been glad. She had married a man who despised her and had spent a year being good to him with no hope of return, and now alone, on her knees, she was not asking God to change her husband's heart or to punish him or even to comfort her in her loneliness. She was asking God to make him happy. She was offering, freely and in secret, to be the unseen means of the happiness of the very man who had wronged her, even if that happiness were another woman. I ask nothing for myself. He had told her on the chapel steps that she should not mistake civility for affection. And she had never mistaken it. She had understood, from the first hour, exactly what he was and exactly what he thought of her, and she had chosen not out of ignorance, not out of hope, but with her eyes wide open, to love him anyway, silently, expecting nothing. Kneeling here in the dark night after night to lift his happiness up to heaven while he drank alone in his cold library and called her a merchant's daughter. The shame of it went through him like a sword and came out the other side, and what was left when it had passed through was not shame any more. It was something he had no name for because he had never let himself feel it toward her. It was the beginning of love, and it came into him not as a sweetness but as a wound, sharp and enormous, undeniable. And he pressed his hand to the cold stone and wept for the year he had thrown away and the good woman he had starved, and the great and terrible discovery that he did not deserve her and could not, now, live without her. He did not go in. He could not have faced her. He could not have borne to have her know he had heard. To let her know would be to make her prayer a thing performed, and it was not performed. It was the truest thing he had ever heard a human being say, and the only way he could honor it was to keep it, for now, secret, as she had meant it to be secret. So he turned in the dark and walked back to the great house with the frost forming on the wet grass, and he did not sleep that night or the next, and when he did at last sleep he dreamed of her lonely face before his mother's portrait, and woke with her name in his mouth and a resolution in his heart that a proud man makes only once in his life, and having made it, cannot unmake. He would win her, not command her. He had a year of commanding behind him and knew now what it had bought, not buy her. She wanted nothing of his. He would win her slowly, humbly, as a man courts a woman who has every reason to refuse him and no reason on earth to believe a word he says. He would spend however long it took undoing the wall of a year, one stone at a time. He would earn, if he could, the smallest fraction of the love she had been pouring out over him in the dark, and if he could not earn it, if a year of cold had killed in her the thing that had knelt in the chapel, then he would at least, God helping him, make her no longer lonely, make her no longer bear it. Be to her at last the husband he had refused for a year to be. He did not know how hard it would be. He learned in the morning. He came down early before her and waited in the small breakfast room, a thing he had never done in a year. He had always breakfasted alone in the west wing. And when she came in and found him there, she stopped in the doorway, plainly startled, her grey shawl still about her against the morning chill, and she said, with the wary, careful courtesy she always wore for him, "Your Grace, I did not expect to forgive me. I will go. I did not mean to intrude." "You do not intrude," he said. "Please." He found to his own astonishment that he did not know how to speak to her. He had spoken to her cruelly for a year, and now that he wished to speak to her kindly the words would not come. They stuck in his throat like something too large. "I hoped we might breakfast together." She did not sit. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with those clear grey eyes, and there was no gladness in them, no leap of hope, nothing of the eager gratitude he might, in his vanity, have half expected. There was only wariness, and under the wariness a great tiredness, and she said carefully, "Has something happened, Your Grace? Is it business? Have I done something to displease you?" And that undid him a second time, that after a whole year the only reasons she could imagine for her husband seeking her company were displeasure or business, and he understood, standing there in the grey morning light, the true size of what he had done. He had taught her that his notice meant pain. He had spent a year teaching her it, and a lesson taught for a year is not unlearned in a morning, however wet his eyes had been in the dark. "No," he said gently, and his own gentleness sounded strange in his ears, unpracticed, like a language learned too late. "You have done nothing to displease me. You have never once displeased me, Marisol." Her name. He had scarcely ever said her name. "I find I have been a very poor husband to you, and I should like, if you will allow it, to begin to be a better one." Silence. The clock in the hall struck the half-hour, and his wife looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not read, and then she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady and perfectly kind and that cut him deeper than any reproach could have, "You need not trouble yourself, Your Grace. I am quite content as things are. I ask nothing of you. I ask nothing for myself." The very words of her prayer turned now to a shield against him. She had asked nothing of him for a year, and she meant to go on asking nothing, and she said it not in bitterness but in a kind of gentle finality. As one closes and latches a door one has decided never to open again. And then she curtsied and turned and went and left him standing alone in the breakfast room he had never once shared with her, holding out an olive branch to an empty doorway. He sat down slowly in the cold chair. So. It was not to be a morning's work, nor a week's. She did not believe him. Why on earth should she believe him? A year of ice does not thaw because the man who made it says a kind word over breakfast. A starved thing does not come to the hand that starved it merely because the hand is opened. And the wall he had built between them he was beginning to understand. He had built so thoroughly and so well that he might spend the rest of his life pulling it down and never reach her at all. But he had heard her, in the dark, ask God to make him happy at the cost of her own life. And a man who has heard that, and knows himself the wretch she prayed for, does not give up because the first stone is hard to shift. He would begin then, at the beginning. He would learn her. He knew nothing of her, nothing true, and so he would learn what she loved, what she feared, what she coughed at in the night, what she had wanted before her father weighed her against a debt. He would make himself, humbly and without hope of quick reward, a student of his own wife. And he would guard her at last from the county's cruelty and from Sabina's as a husband ought, and he would be there in the cold cottages, in the sick rooms, at the deathbeds beside her, so that she should never again bear alone the burdens she had been bearing alone for a year while he drank in the dark. It was not much of a plan. It was only a beginning. But he made it that morning in the empty breakfast room, and he never after wavered from it, through all the hard weeks that followed and the hard hour that nearly took her from him before he could make it good. He began with the widow Nance. He had heard his wife promise in the dark to sit with the dying woman, and to confess she was not sure she had the courage. And so on the second morning after the chapel, when word came up to the house that old Nance was sinking at last, and Marisol put on her plainest gown and her stout boots and took the basket of things she always took. Alaric was in the hall before her, in his riding coat, and he said, "I will come with you." She stared at him. "Your Grace, it is a poor cottage, and the woman is dying, and there is nothing there for you to—" "There is my wife there," he said, "sitting up alone with a dying woman, which she has done a dozen times this year, which I did not know, and which she will not do alone again while I am able to stand beside her. Get in the carriage, Marisol, or I shall walk beside it the whole way and look very foolish, and the tenants will talk." Something flickered in her grey eyes, surprise, and under it a weariness so deep it was almost fear, as if a long cold hearth suspected the man kneeling before it of meaning to burn the house down after all. But she got in the carriage, and she said nothing on the drive, and he said nothing, and when they came to the low dark cottage where the widow Nance lay dying, by the light of a rushlight with her frightened married daughter wringing her hands in the corner, Alaric found that he did not know what to do, and his wife did, and so he did the only wise thing he had done in a year. He watched her, and he followed. He watched her cross the filthy little room, without a flicker of the fastidiousness he would once have shown, and sit down on the edge of the wretched bed, and take the old woman's clawed and frightened hand in both her own, and speak to her low and warm and steady, of the fields the old woman had known as a girl, of the church she had married in, of the God who was waiting and was not angry, of nothing at all that mattered and everything that mattered, until the fear went slowly out of the wrinkled face and the labored breathing eased, and the old woman, who had been afraid to die, held the young Duchess's hand and was not afraid. And Alaric, standing in the shadow by the door where a year ago he would never have deigned to stand, understood a thing he had not understood before about the woman he had married. It was not that she was kind. Kindness was cheap. The county was full of ladies who were kind, who left cards and sent soup. It was that she was brave. She went into the rooms other people fled, the fever rooms, the death rooms, the rooms where the poor lay in their fear and their filth. And she went in not because she was fearless, but because she was afraid, and went in anyway, having decided that her fear was a smaller thing than another creature's need. He had lived a year beside a courage greater than his own, and had called it merchant's cunning. The widow Nance died a little after midnight, quietly with Marisel's hand in hers, and the daughter wept, and Marisel held the daughter too, and Alaric, who had done nothing all night but keep the fire fed and hold the rushlight, and once, when the old woman was thirsty, lift her head so his wife could give her water, drove his wife home through the black frozen lanes in a silence that was, for the first time in their year, not a cold silence but only a tired one, a silence shared. At the door of the great house, before she went up to the east wing, she paused and looked at him, and said, not warmly, not yet, but with the first thread of something other than warriness in her voice, "Thank you, your grace, for the water. She could not have taken it from me. I had not the strength to lift her. You were of use tonight. You were of use. To another man it might have seemed a small thing, even a cool thing. To Alaric, who had spent a year being of no use to any living soul and every use to his own pride, it was the first coin of a currency he meant to spend the rest of his life earning. He bowed to her, real bow, not the correct statue's inclination of their wedding day, and said good night, Marisel, and watched her climb the stairs with her candle, and heard, from the turning of the stair, before she was out of earshot, the small dry cough that his steward had told him of, and that he had never once, in a year, troubled to hear. He did not sleep. He sent the next morning to the town for the best physician in the county, and had him to the house on a pretext, and put to him quietly the question of a weak chest and a cough that came at night, and the physician frowned and asked to see the Duchess and Marisel. When Alaric asked her, did not command, to see the man, gave him again that steady unreadable look, and said, I am quite well, your grace. It is nothing, a little cough. It comes every winter and goes every spring. Humour me, he said. You have humoured me in worse things this year. Humour me in this. And that the plain acknowledgment of his own wrongs, without excuse into the middle of a sentence, did what all his gentleness had not quite done. It startled a true look out of her, a real look, unguarded for half a breath, in which he saw that she had heard him, that she understood he was not merely being kind but was, in his clumsy proud way, confessing, and she lowered her eyes and said more quietly, very well, if it will ease you. And she saw the physician. His verdict was grave enough to frighten Alaric and not so grave as to comfort him. The Duchess had a delicacy of the chest. It was not consumption, the man thought, not yet, but it was a weakness that the cold and wet and overwork of her charitable winters would surely worsen. She must rest more, take less of the night air, be spared the sick rooms if it could be managed. She would not be spared them, the physician added dryly, having met the Duchess, but her husband might do worse than to see she was warm and fed, and not left to sit up alone through the small hours in unheated cottages, warm and fed, and not left alone. Alaric had given his wife a year of cold, of the correct half of his attention, of the loneliness he had seen once in the gallery and looked away from. He set himself now to give her the opposite, and he found it was the hardest work of his life, harder than managing the ruined estate, harder than facing the county's contempt, because every kindness he offered her had to travel across the whole width of a year of cruelty to reach her, and most of them did not reach. He had her rooms warmed. He gave orders that the east wing fires were to be kept high, and she thanked him with cool courtesy. He learned from Mrs. Penhale, had the fires banked down again the moment he was out of the house, because her grace won't burn wood the tenants need, sir, not for her own comfort, she never has. He sent up delicacies from the town, and she had them sent on to the sick. He tried to spare her the cottages, and she went to the cottages. She would take nothing from him, nothing at all, and he understood slowly that it was not spite, it was that she had spent a year needing nothing from him as a matter of survival, had built her whole dignity on needing nothing from him, and could not now, at his sudden turning, simply lay that dignity down at the feet of the man who had made it necessary. To need him would be to be at his mercy again. And she had learned, at bitter cost, exactly how much mercy there had been in him. So he changed his method. He stopped trying to give her things. He began, instead, to give her himself, which was the one gift she could not send on to the sick or bank down when he left the room. He rode out with her on her rounds. He learned the tenants' names, really learned them, as she knew them, with their troubles and their children and their griefs attached. He carried the baskets. He mended, with his own hands, one raw afternoon, a broken shutter on the Hartleys' cottage while his wife dozed a sick child within, and came in from the cold with his knuckles bleeding, and found her watching him from the doorway with an expression he had not seen on her before, startled, almost soft, quickly hidden. He learned the ledgers of her charity, which were meticulous and secret, and shamed the accounts of his estate. He found she had been quietly making up, from her own strict allowance, the shortfalls his father's ruin had left in the tenants' relief, and had told no one, least of all him. He learned that she read late theology, history, the grave heavy books of his father's library that no one had opened in years, and one night, finding her in the library where he had once drunk alone, he did not withdraw and leave her the room, but sat down across from her with a book of his own, and they read in silence, and it was the first evening of their marriage they had ever spent together that was not a battle or a duty, and when the clock struck 11 she rose and said good night in a voice fractionally less guarded than her voice of the morning, and Alaric counted it a victory greater than any he had ever won at anything. The stones came down slowly. She thawed by degrees so small he could measure them only by looking back across weeks. A first true smile, surprised out of her by some clumsiness of his over a tangled harness, quickly stifled but seen. A morning she came down to breakfast without being sought, and found him there, and did not flee. A conversation about the price of wool that turned, without either of them steering it, into a conversation about her girlhood, and the counting house where she had grown up, and the mother she had lost at 12, and the loneliness of a rich merchant's daughter who was neither trade enough for trade nor gentle enough for the gentry, a loneliness, Alaric realized with a turn of the heart, not so unlike the loneliness of a duke's overlooked son. We are alike, then, he said, before he could weigh the words, you and I, both raised in cold houses by fathers who did not know how to love us. She went very still, and she looked at him across the breakfast table with her clear grey eyes, and for a long moment he thought he had gone too far, presumed too far, reached across the year too fast. Then she said quietly, yes, I think we are. And she did not flee, and she did not close the shutter, and she poured him his coffee with her own hand, which she had never done, and the small domestic ordinariness of it went through Alaric Rookhurst like sunlight through cold water, and he thought, I could love this woman for the whole of my life, and it will not be a moment too long to make up what I owe her. But he did not say it. He knew better now than to say it. A word of love from him, this soon, she would not believe, or would fear. She had heard him swear on the chapel steps that he would never choose her, and no speech would unswear it. Only years would unswear it. He was prepared to give the years. He was not, however, the only one keeping accounts. Across the eastern boundary, in her father's fine cold house, Lady Sabina Merrow had marked the change in the Duke of Rookhurst. The dinners he now declined, the rides he no longer took with her, the new and unwelcome sight of the Duke and his merchant Duchess seen together in the lanes, at church, on the terrace, heads bent close, and Sabina Merrow, who had waited half her life to be the Duchess of Rookhurst, and had watched the prize handed to a wool merchant's daughter, was not a woman to lose a second time in silence. She had a weapon. She had had it, in fact, for some months, and had held it in reserve, as a careful gambler holds a card, and in the black heart of that winter, when it became plain to her that she had lost the Duke not to the marriage but to the wife, she played it. There was a morning in December that Alaric came, ever after, to think of as the true turning of the ice. It had snowed in the night, the first real snow of that winter, and the park lay white and silent and blue-shadowed under a low pewter sky, and Alaric, coming down early as had become his habit. He who a year ago had never risen before he chose, found the breakfast room empty and his wife's cloak gone from its peg, and a servant told him her grace had walked out toward the home wood before it was fully light. He went after her. He did not know why, there was no need, but he had begun, that winter, to want to be where she was, with a simple animal want that had nothing of duty in it, and that he was still learning not to be ashamed of. He found her at the edge of the wood, standing very still in the snow, and he thought at first she was praying and stopped, not to disturb her. But she was not praying, she was watching a robin. It had come down almost to her feet, bald with hunger, and she had crumbled a piece of bread from her pocket. She carried bread, he had learned, for exactly such small mercies, and was letting the crumbs fall one by one slowly, so as not to frighten it, and her face, unaware of him, was lit with a quiet delight so childlike and so unguarded that Alaric stood in the snow, and could not have spoken to save his life. He had spent a year, he thought, believing this woman calculated everything, that her every kindness was an investment, her every softness a trade. And here she was in the blue snow at first light, alone, believing herself unseen, feeding a robin one crumb at a time out of pure gladness at the small brave life of it, with no county to admire her and no husband to win and nothing whatever to gain. This was who she was when no one watched. This was the woman under all the grey silk and the composure he had called cunning, and he had nearly gone to his grave with ever once seeing her. The robin took its fill and flew, and she watched it go, and then she turned and saw him, and the light did not leave her face as quickly as it once would have. That was the winter's gift, that her face no longer shuttered at the sight of him the instant it appeared. "You are abroad early, your grace," she said. "So are you." He came to her through the snow. "You were feeding the birds." "A foolishness," she said, but she was almost smiling. "My mother did it, when I was small, before she died. She said a house was not kind, unless it was kind even to the sparrows on its sill, that anyone could be gracious to those who could repay it, but that you knew a soul's true measure by how it treated the creatures who could give it nothing back." She looked away. "I have thought of that a great deal this year and more, about giving to what cannot repay." And Alaric understood that she was speaking of him, that he had been, for a year, precisely the creature who could give nothing back, and that she had gone on scattering her crumbs of kindness before him one by one, just as she scattered them now before the robin, out of a goodness so deep it had nothing to do with return, and the humility of it went through him again, as it had at the chapel door. And he did the thing he had been aching to do for weeks and had not dared. He took off his glove and reached out slowly, so as not to frighten her, exactly as she had reached toward the robin, and he took her small, cold, ungloved hand in his bare one, there in the snow, and he did not say anything, and he did not let go. She did not pull away. She looked down at their two joined hands, dark against the white, and she was very still for a long moment, and then her fingers curled faintly around his, the smallest pressure, the first she had ever given him unbidden, and she said, so low he barely heard it over the hush of the snow, "You are very changed, Alaric." "I am trying to be," he said. "It is slow work. I had a great deal to change." "Why?" she asked. And she lifted her clear grey eyes to his, and the question was not a challenge, it was almost a plea, and he saw that it mattered to her more than she wished it to, and that she was afraid of the answer, whichever way it fell. "Why now? A year you scarcely looked at me." And then, of a sudden, in the autumn, why, he nearly told her, the chapel, the prayer, the whole of it hung on his lips. But he did not tell her, not then, it was too soon, and to hand her the knowledge that he had overheard her most secret prayer would be to take from her the one wholly private thing she had left, and he would not do it, not until she was safe enough in his love to hear it without shame. So he said only and truly, "Because I woke up. I had been asleep in my own bitterness for a year, longer, for the whole of my grown life, I think, and one autumn night something woke me, and I saw what was in front of me. That is all. I saw you. I had never once looked, and then I looked, and there you were, and you were better than anything I had ever thrown away my happiness to avoid, and I have been trying ever since to make myself into a man who might deserve to have looked." She was quiet. The snow began softly to fall again, small dry flakes settling on her dark hair and her lashes. "You need not deserve me," she said at last. "That is not how it works. My mother knew that. You cannot earn a thing that is only worth having as a gift. You can only receive it. And I do not think you have ever, in your whole life, let yourself simply receive a thing, Alaric. You take or you refuse or you pay, but you do not receive. It is why you are so tired. It is why you are so cold. A man cannot warm himself who will not accept the fire. He stood in the falling snow with her cold hand in his and her words going through him like the truest sermon he had ever heard. And he thought that she was, without any doubt, the wisest and the best creature he had ever known, and that he had spent a year calling her a merchant's daughter, and that he would spend the rest of his life ashamed of it and grateful past, all telling that he had been given the years in which to be ashamed. Then teach me, he said, to receive. I do not know how. Teach me. And she looked at him for a long moment, the snow between them, and then she did a thing that undid him more completely than any word could have. She stepped close into the shelter of him against the cold, and leaned her head, lightly for one moment, against his shoulder. The whole weight of her guardedness set down at last, just for that moment, just to see if he would hold, and Alaric put his arm about her, slowly, as a man cups a flame against the wind, and held her, and did not move, and let the snow fall on them both, and received it. The weight of her, the trust of her, the terrible fragile gift of her leaning, received it, and did not pay for it, and did not refuse it, and felt the last cold place in him go warm. They walked back to the house through the snow with her hand in his arm, and neither said much. And it did not matter, and Mrs. Penhale, watching from the window as they came up the white avenue, wiped her eyes on her apron and went to tell the kitchen that the master and her Grace had come in from the snow hand in hand, plain as day, and that the long cold year was over at Rookhurst. And about time, and thank God. That was the true beginning of their winter's happiness, and it deepened week upon week, in 100 small, ordinary ways that Alaric would not have thought, a year before, could make up the substance of a life, and now knew to be the whole of it. She read to him in the evenings, and he to her, their 2 chairs drawn near before one fire now instead of 2 cold rooms apart. She taught him the names of the tenants' children and the histories of their griefs, and he found, to his surprise, that he came to love the people of his own land, whom he had ruled all his life and never known. She showed him her secret charity ledgers at last, shy of them. And he did not scold her for the money spent, but sat up half a night going through them with real admiration, and then quietly saw to it that the estate itself took up the burdens she had been carrying alone from her own purse, so that she need not stint her own small comforts to keep the parish warm, and she wept when she understood what he had done, and could not tell him why, and he did not need telling. He knew. It was that no one had ever, in her whole life, lightened a load for her without being asked. She had lightened everyone's. No one had ever lightened hers. He learned her fears too, one by one, as a man learns a country. He learned that she was afraid of thunder, a thing she was ashamed of and hid, and that she had hidden it for a year of storms alone in the east wing. And after he learned it, he came to her, the next storm, without being sent for, and sat with her while it passed, and said nothing about it, and she was grateful past words and said nothing either, and it became one of the unspoken things between them. The way that in a true marriage the deepest kindnesses are often the ones never once named aloud. He learned that she grieved her mother still, 12 years on, with a grief that had never had anywhere to go, and he found, in an old trunk of his own mother's things, a small enamelled locket, and had a lock of no. He learned, more truly, simply to let her speak of her mother, which no one had ever let her do, and to listen, which was the whole of what she had wanted and never had, and he learned that she coughed at night, of course, more than she let anyone see, and that the delicacy of her chest was a real and growing thing, and it was the one knowledge that gave him no pleasure, because it frightened him, and because it stood, he sometimes felt, like a shadow at the edge of all their new bright happiness, a reminder that he had come to love her late, and that the years he had wasted were years he could never have back, and that the time left them, whatever it was less than it might have been, because he had thrown a year of it into the fire of his own pride. He did not know, that snowbound happy December, how soon and how nearly that shadow would rise up and try to take her from him altogether. He knew only that he loved her, that he had not yet told her so, waiting for her to be ready to believe it, and that he meant to tell her, and to spend his whole life proving it in whatever time they were given. He thought they had time. He had begun, in his happiness, to believe they had all the time in the world. They did not. Sabina Merrow's letter was already in the county, and the flood was already rising, 3 days off, in the black winter rain to come. There was, too, in those first weeks of his turning, the matter of his own household to reckon with, for a house takes its temper from its master, and Rookhurst had learned its coldness from Alaric, and did not unlearn it overnight merely because he had. The servants had loved the Duchess for a year in secret, the way one loves a kindness one dare not praise aloud for fear of the master's displeasure, and when the master's displeasure lifted, when he began of a sudden to seek her Grace's company and to warm her fires and to ride out at her side. The household did not at first know what to make of it, and watched, wary, expecting the cold to return. Alaric felt them watching. He was not, whatever else he had been, a stupid man, and he understood that his own people were braced against him, waiting to see whether this thaw was a true spring or only a January sun that would betray them. And he understood, too, that they were braced on the Duchess's behalf, that they had taken her part, silently, all that year, and did not trust the man who had made her lonely not to make her lonely again. He set himself to earn their trust as he was earning hers, and by the same slow, honest means. He thanked Mrs. Penhale, one morning plainly, for the care she had taken of her Grace through a hard year. For the little kindnesses he now knew the old housekeeper had done his wife when he would not, the extra coal slipped up to the east wing against orders, the cook's small offerings, the warmth of a changed voice. He had not known, until his own eyes were opened, how much the servants of a great house see, and how much they can soften or sharpen the loneliness of those they serve, and he told Mrs. Penhale that he knew it now, and was grateful, and had been a fool, and would be one no longer. The old woman, who had served 3 dukes and feared none of them, and had certainly never before heard one call himself a fool, was so astonished that she forgot to curtsy, and then she wept, and then she went straight down to the kitchen and told them all that the master was mended, truly mended, and that they might love her Grace as openly as they liked from this day, for the Duke loved her too, plain as day, whatever he had not yet found the words to say, and the house warmed as a house does, from the servants' hall upward, for the affection of a household, once given leave, spreads faster than any order, and within a month Rookhurst, which had been for a year a place of shut doors and lowered voices and 2 cold wings and a colder middle, had become a place where the maids sang on the stairs again, and the grooms whistled, and the cook sent up dishes not from duty but from love, and the whole great old house seemed to lean, like a plant toward light, toward the small grave figure of the Duchess who had thawed it without ever once trying to. Alaric saw all this and marvelled at it, and understood at last the thing his father had never taught him and had never known himself, that a great house is not made great by its blood or its acres or its name, but by the love that moves through it, that his father had died in a rich cold mansion and Alaric had nearly done the same, and that his wife, the wool merchant's daughter he had despised, had brought into the pawned and shamed old pile of Rookhurst the one thing all its dukes and all its gold had never managed to buy, and had brought it not by trying to be a duchess, but simply by being, in every room she entered. He told her so one evening clumsily, over their 2 chairs and their 1 fire, and she coloured and looked away, and said it was nonsense, that a house warmed itself when its master ceased to freeze it. But he saw that the telling pleased her, and he resolved to tell her true things more often, having spent a year telling her cold ones, and finding that the true warm ones cost him nothing and bought him everything. It was in those same weeks that he began quietly to set right the graver injustice under which she had lived, the injustice of the county, which had received her a year before as a curiosity and a climber, had watched the Duke's coldness and drawn its cruel conclusions, and had never once given the merchant's Duchess the plain courtesy it would have given the meanest gentlewoman of the old blood. Alaric had let that stand all that year out of his own bitterness, had let his wife be slighted at Sabina's dinners and whispered of in drawing-rooms and left alone in a corner of every gathering, and had told himself it was no concern of his, it was his concern. A husband's honour is his wife's shield, and he had thrown the shield in the ditch, and left her to stand bare before the county's contempt for a year, and he set himself now week by week to take it up again, to be seen at her side, to speak of her with pride, to make it known. By every means a duke commands, that whoever slighted the Duchess of Rookhurst slighted the duke, and would answer for it. And the county, which had followed his coldness readily enough, followed his warmth too, being a creature that always follows power. And the same drawing-rooms that had whispered against her began, cautiously to court her, and found, as everyone found who came near her, that she was better than her reputation and finer than her birth, and gentler with their contempt than they had any right to expect, and the tide, that winter, began to turn in her favour, even before the flood and the fever and the ball turned it altogether. Alaric watched it turn, and knew he had begun it too late, and that a truly great man would have stood by her from the first hour, and he did not let himself off that reckoning, but held it always before him, as a man keeps a scar to remember a folly by. He had wronged her before the county for a year. It was not enough, now, to love her in private. He must right her in public, as publicly as he had let her be wronged, or the loving was only half a thing. That resolve, formed in the warming December house, was the seed of the great spring ball to come, and of everything he did there before the assembled county. But that was months off and lay on the far side of the flood, and he did not yet know how much would have to be nearly lost before he could make it good. He knew only that he loved her more with every ordinary day, that the house was warm, that the county was turning, that he had a lifetime, he believed, in which to finish the work of righting what he had wronged. He believed he had a lifetime. He had not yet stood on the black bank of a winter flood and understood, in one drowning instant, how little of a lifetime any man is promised, and how much of it he had already thrown away. Sabina's weapon was a letter, or rather, a bundle of them, 3 years old, tied in a faded ribbon. Love letters, ardent and unwise, that Alaric had written her in the summer before his father's ruin, when the county had thought them as good as betrothed, and Alaric, young and in love with being in love, had put his heart on paper in a way he had long since ceased to feel. She had kept them. Sabina Merrow kept everything that might one day be spent. She did not send them to Alaric. That would have been crude, and Sabina was not crude. She sent them, copied out fair, with a few small poisonous additions in a hand very like Alaric's own, additions that turned a young man's old ardour into a present and continuing thing, to the county, not openly. A word here, a hint there. A paper accidentally, left where the vicar's gossiping wife would find it. A rumour set walking that the Duke of Rookhurst had never left off loving Sabina Merrow, that his sudden attentions to his wife were a blind, that letters passed between the Duke and Lady Sabina even now, that the merchant's duchess was a laughing-stock who did not know her husband kept his true heart across the eastern boundary, and she made certain, by the surest of country channels, that the rumour and a sample of the letters reached the one person in the county she most wished to wound, Marisol. Alaric knew none of this while it was doing its work. He was that winter happier than he had been in the whole of his adult life, and happiness had made him for once less watchful. He had a wife who no longer fled the breakfast room, who read with him in the evenings, who had Christmas Eve, in the little chapel among the yews at the end of the service, laid her ungloved hand for one moment over his where it rested on the pew rail, and let it stay there through the last carol, and said nothing, and neither had he, and it had been the most eloquent moment of his life. He had a marriage that was becoming, stone by fallen stone, a marriage. He was so intent on the slow miracle of it that he did not see the shadow gathering until it had already fallen across his house. He saw it, at last, in her face. He came in one grey afternoon in late January from a ride and found her in the long gallery, where he had once seen her lonely before his mother's portrait, and she was standing there again, but she was not lonely now. She was cold, cold in the old way, the way of their first winter, the shutter down over the grey eyes, and when he came to her and said her name gladly, she turned to him a face he had not seen in months, closed and careful and unreachable, and said, "Your Grace, I am glad you have come. There is something I would ask you, and I would ask you to answer it plainly, as you once valued plainness above all things." His heart went cold. "Ask it. Do you love Lady Sabina Merrow?" He stared at her. "No," he said. "Marisol, have you ever loved her?" He could have lied. "A lesser man would have," he said. "Yes. 3 years ago, before my father's ruin, before I knew what she was, I fancied myself in love with her. And I wrote her foolish letters that I would give a year of my life to have back. It was over long before you came. It has been nothing but ashes for 3 years. Marisol, whatever you have heard, I have seen the letters, she said, and her steady voice cracked. Just once on the word, and it was worse than any weeping, or copies of them. They were sent to me, ardent things. And other things, later things in your hand, or very like it, that speak of now, of this winter, of a love that continues, of a wife who is only a blind. The whole county has them, or has heard of them. I am told everyone knew but me. I am told your kindness to me these 3 months has been a performance to quiet talk, while you— She stopped. She pressed her hand hard against her breast, and coughed, and mastered it, and went on, low and terribly even. I do not ask because I have any right to your heart, your grace. You told me, at the very beginning, exactly what to expect, and I did not expect otherwise, and I have no complaint of you. But I will not be made a fool of before the whole county. And I will not. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. I will not let myself have begun to hope, only to find the hope was the cruelest parlous part of the trick. So I am asking you plainly, is your kindness true, or is it a performance for the world, and Lady Sabina your true heart still? And Alaric understood, in that moment, the full and terrible price of the year he had wasted. If he had never told her on the chapel steps that he would never choose her, if he had never spent a year proving that his notice meant pain and his kindness a lie, then she would have known in her bones that the letters were a slander. She would have laughed at them. A woman secure in her husband's love does not fear a rival's old letters. But he had taught her with his own mouth and a year of his own conduct, exactly the thing Sabina's poison depended upon, that his coldness was his true self and his kindness a mask. Sabina had not invented the lie. Alaric had built it a year ago on the chapel steps, and Sabina had merely moved into the house he left standing. It is not a performance, he said, and his own voice shook, which it never did. Before God, Marisol, it is not a performance. The letters to Sabina are 3 years old, and I disown every word of them. Any letter that speaks of this winter is a forgery. I have written her nothing. I have scarcely spoken to her in months. I told her in the autumn that she would oblige me by never again speaking of you in my house, and she has not forgiven me for it, and this is her revenge. My kindness to you is the one true thing I have done in a year. I know you have no reason to believe me. I gave you a year of reasons not to. But it is the truth, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you will let me have the rest of my life to do it in. She looked at him for a long, long moment, and he saw the war in her grey eyes, the wish to believe him at war with the year of hard-won wisdom that told her not to, the frightened newborn hope at war with the memory of the chapel steps. The woman who had knelt in the dark and asked God only for his happiness at war with the woman who now, God help her, wanted something for herself at last and did not dare. I want to believe you, she whispered. That is the worst of it. I want to believe you so much that I cannot trust my own wanting. If I believe you and I am wrong, she shook her head. I bore a year of your coldness, your grace, and it did not break me, because I expected nothing, but I do not think I could bear to be given hope and have it taken. That would break me, and so I dare not. Forgive me, I dare not. And she left him there in the gallery beneath his mother's sad-eyed portrait, and Alaric stood alone with the ruin of 3 months' patient work scattered at his feet by a bundle of 3-year-old letters, and understood that Sabina had aimed her poison with a devil's precision, not to make Marisol hate him, but to make Marisol afraid to love him, which, in a woman who had already spent a year loving him in secret and expecting nothing, was the crueler and the surer wound. He did not go after her. He went, instead, out to his horse and rode across the eastern boundary in the failing light, and presented himself at Sabina Merrow's door, and was shown into her drawing-room, and Sabina rose to meet him with a smile of such perfect false surprise that he knew, past any doubt, the whole of what she had done. Alaric, what an unlooked-for! I know it was you, he said. The letters, the forgeries, the whispers. I know it was you, Sabina, and I have come to tell you that it will not answer, and to ask you once, plainly, as a gentleman asks, to stop. The smile did not waver. That was the most frightening thing about her. It never wavered. I am sure I do not know what you mean. If old letters of yours have found their way about the county, Alaric, that is hardly my doing. You should not have written them. And if your merchant's daughter is distressed by them, perhaps she is not so serene as she pretends. Perhaps trade feels things after all. She tilted her dark head. You are angry, it becomes you. You are always at your best angry. Come, Alaric, let us not quarrel. You know as well as I do that this marriage of yours is a grotesque, a debt paid in flesh, a great old name pawned to a counting house. Cast her off. Any court in the land would pity you. Be free of her, and be what you were meant to be, what we were meant to be. And Alaric looked at Sabina Merrow, beautiful, brilliant, without one grain of mercy in her whole composition, and he thought of his wife on her knees in the dark chapel asking God to make him happy, even if his happiness were this woman, and the contrast was so absolute, so total, that he wondered how he had ever, even 3 years ago, even as a foolish boy, mistaken the one for anything a man might want. You have misjudged me, Sabina, he said quietly. You think I am the man I was 3 years ago, or the man I was a year ago. I am not. My wife is worth 10,000 of you, and I would not trade one strand of her hair for the whole of you and everything you will ever be, and I have come to tell you so, and to tell you this besides. If one more whisper of your making touches her name, I will make it my whole business to see that no door in this county opens to you again. I can do it. You know I can. Now good evening. He left her white-faced and speechless, which he suspected no man had ever managed before, and rode home through the dark with his resolution hardened to iron. He would clear his wife's name, he would face down the county's gossip publicly and completely, and he would prove to Marisol, not in words she could not trust, but in acts she could not deny, that her hope was not a trick. He did not yet know how. He would find how. He did not find it in time. For while he had been across the eastern boundary putting the fear of ruin into Sabina Merrow, the poison had done a further work he had not foreseen. Marisol alone, wretched, believing herself a laughingstock, unable either to trust her husband or to stop wanting to, and worn thin already by a hard winter of sick rooms and self-denial, and a chest the physician had warned was failing, had done the thing she always did with grief. She had gone out to be of use. Word had come, that same afternoon, of fever in the Prynne cottage, the whole family down with it, the mother worst and Marisol, wanting to be anywhere but under the roof where her heart was breaking, had ridden out alone into the sleet, without telling the house, to nurse them. And when Alaric came home at 9 o'clock, cold and resolved and full of the case he meant to make to his wife, he found the house in an uproar and Mrs. Penhale white as her apron in the hall, and learned that her Grace had gone out hours since, alone into the worst of the weather, to a house full of a bad fever, and had not come back, and that the sleet had turned to a driving, freezing rain, and that no one knew in the black wild dark whether the Duchess of Rookhurst was in the fever cottage or lost on the flooded lanes between, and that her chest was weak, and that she had gone out with her heart broken by a slander he had not yet had the chance to disprove. He did not wait for a lantern to be found. He took the first horse in the stable, saddled or unsaddled he did not stop to see, and rode down to the black roaring night with the freezing rain flaying his face and his wife's name a hammer in his chest. The lanes were half under water. The little brook that crossed the valley bottom, which a child could step over in July, had risen with 3 days' rain into a brown flood that had drowned the ford, and the road to the Prynne cottage ran through that ford, and Alaric, coming down to it in the streaming dark, his horse plunging and refusing a black rushing water, understood that if his wife had ridden out this afternoon before the flood had risen, she could not now ride back. She was either safe in the cottage on the far side, or she had tried the ford as it rose and been taken by it, and there was no way to know which but to cross, and no way to cross that a wise man would take. He was not knight, a wise man. He was a man who had wasted a year and had, for 3 months, been given a second chance he did not deserve, and had let it be poisoned out from under him that very afternoon, and would sooner drown than let his wife die on the far side of a flood, believing herself a laughingstock and her hope a trick. He turned the horse upstream, along the bank in the dark, feeling for the place he half remembered, where the brook widened and ran shallow over gravel, and he found it, or found something like it, and he put the terrified horse at the black water, and it went into the girth, to the belly, staggering, and the cold took his legs away and the current dragged at them, and for one long moment in the middle of the flood he thought they were both gone, And then the horse's hooves found gravel, and it lunged, and they were up the far bank, streaming and shaking, alive. The Prynne cottage showed a low light. He came off the horse at the door and through it without knocking, and the fetid heat of the sickroom struck him after the killing cold outside. And there, kneeling by the low bed where the fever-stricken mother lay, a wet cloth in her hand, her own gown soaked through and steaming faintly in the fire's heat, her face grey with exhaustion and streaked where she had been weeping and not weeping now, only working, only being of use as she always was. There was his wife, alive. She looked up when the door crashed. And her face, when she saw him, soaked wine from a branch across the brow, having plainly ridden a flood to reach her. Her face did something he had never seen it do. The shutter did not come down. It could not. She was too far past her strength to work it. For one unguarded instant her whole heart was in her face, and what was in it was not wariness and not fear, but a naked, wondering, terrified relief. Relief that he had come through the flood, that he had come for her. And then she remembered, and grief and doubt crowded back over the relief, and she said, in a cracked whisper, "You should not have come. The Ford you might have." And then she coughed, and could not stop, and the coughing bent her double, and it went on, a deep tearing sound that frightened the very Prynnes in their fever, and when it ended there was blood on her lips. Alaric crossed the room and caught her before she fell. The rest of that night he lived through afterward only in fragments, the way one remembers a fever of one's own. He remembered wrapping her in his own soaked coat, which was worse than useless, and then in blankets, and holding her against the tearing cough. He remembered that she would not leave the Prynne mother, that even ruined and bleeding she gasped out the woman's medicine, the times, the doses, until he swore to see it done, and he saw it done, he who a year ago had never entered a tenant's cottage, kneeling by a stranger's fever bed and dosing her from his warm, careful hand while his wife lay collapsed against the wall too spent to stand. He remembered that the flood cut them off till near dawn, that there was no fetching the physician, no fetching anything, that he built the fire up and held his wife through the black, remaining hours of the night with her burning face against his throat and her breath a terrible wet rattle in her chest, and that somewhere in those hours he stopped praying to be forgiven and began, simply to pray. To the God she talked to in the chapel as to an old friend, the God he had ignored his whole life, to let her live, only let her live. He would ask nothing else, ever of anything, only let her live. Toward dawn she woke a little from the stupor of exhaustion and fever, and knew him, and he saw her try, even then, to be brave, to be no trouble, to ask nothing. "You will take cold," she whispered. "You are wet through. Go and dry yourself." I shall do very well. You must not." "Be quiet," he said gently and held her closer. "Be quiet, my heart. For once in your life let someone do for you. You have done for the whole county for a year and asked nothing and taken nothing, and you have nearly killed yourself of it, and I have let you, and I will let you no longer. Be quiet. I have you, my heart." He had never called her so. He felt her go still against him, felt her hear it, and then, because she was too weak now to hide anything, because the flood and the fever had washed away in one night the wall that a year could not, he felt her weep. Not the composed, silent grief he had glimpsed once in the gallery, but real weeping at last. A whole year of it, the loneliness and the cold and the poison of the letters and the terror of the flood and the daring, unbearable hope, all of it breaking out of her against his chest. And he held her through it and did not try to stop it, and murmured over her wet hair the only true things he had, over and over, that he had heard her, one night in the chapel, that he had heard every word, that he had known since that night that she was worth more than his whole ruined name and everything in it, that the letters were a lie and Sabina a viper, and his kindness the one true thing left in him, that he had loved her, he said it, at last, into her hair in the grey dawn of the flooded cottage, with the rattle in her chest and the blood on her lips, that he had loved her since the night he stood in the dark and heard her ask God to make him happy at the cost of her own life, and that he did not deserve it, and did not care whether he deserved it, only that it was true. "You heard me," she whispered, "in the chapel. You heard. Every word. Then you knew. All this winter. You knew I knew," he said. "And I have been trying ever since to become a man you might one day be able to love back without being ashamed of the choice, and I have not managed it yet. But I will manage it, Marisol, if you will only live and give me the years, and I will manage it. That is the whole of what I want in the world. There is no Sabina, there is no county, there is no ledger, no debt, no merchant's daughter, no wronged old name. There is only you, whom I wronged for a year and have loved for a winter, and whom I will love, if God lets me, for the whole of the rest of my life, only live. She did not answer. She had slipped back into the stupor, her breath rattling, her face burning. And Alaric sat against the cold wall of the Prynne cottage with his wife in his arms and the fire dying and the flood roaring outside in the dark, and held her, and prayed, and waited for the water to fall and the dawn to break, not knowing whether he had told her he loved her in time for her to keep it, or too late. The flood fell at first light. The physician was fetched by the fastest horse in the county. Alaric sent for him the instant the ford was passable, and would hear of no delay. And Marisol was carried home to Rookhurst, wrapped in every blanket the cottage held, and put to bed in the east wing with the fires built high at last, high and higher, and she did not this time have them banked down, because she was too ill to give the order, and Alaric had given the servants a different order, in a voice that no one in the house had ever heard from him, and no one disobeyed, that the Duchess's rooms were to be kept warm as summer, that she was to want for nothing, that he himself was not to be moved from her side, for any cause under heaven short of the house itself burning down. And there he stayed, the great cold Duke of Rookhurst, who a year ago had breakfasted alone in the west wing, and could not have told you whether his wife took sugar, sat by her bed day and night through the long dangerous week that followed, while the fever burned in her weak chest, and the physician came and went with a graver face each visit, and the county, the same county that had whispered Sabina's poison, held its breath, because word had gone out, as word does, that the little merchant duchess who had nursed half the parish through its fevers now lay dying of one she had caught in a poor man's cottage, and that the duke, the proud cold duke, would not leave her, and wept. He did weep. He had not wept since he was a boy until the night at the chapel door, and now the tears came easily, the way they come to a man whose pride has been broken all the way through at last, and he did not care who saw. He sat by her bed and held her burning hand, and talked to her through the delirium. Of the fields she loved, of the tenants by name, of the spring that was coming, of the chestnuts that would flower again along the avenue, and that they would walk under together, he promised her, if only she would come back and walk. He read to her from the grave heavy theology she loved, and that he was only now, too late, beginning to love because she had loved it. He sent for her father, swallowed a year of his contempt for trade, and sent himself a letter to the wool merchant asking him to come to his daughter's sickbed, because she had prayed for the man in the dark, and Alaric would not have her die without him if she wished him there. And the old merchant came and stood by the bed and wept too in his rough way, and said to Alaric in the passage low, "She were always the best of us, your grace, the best of the whole family, and we never knew what to do with her. I gave her to you to pay a debt. God forgive me. She were worth more than the whole debt and the whole estate and my whole life, and I never told her so. Tell her," Alaric said, "when she wakes. Tell her. We have both of us waited too long to tell her things, and I do not mean to wait again." On the 7th night the fever broke. The days of her mending were, for Alaric, the strangest and most precious of his life, and he learned in them a truth that the strong are seldom taught, that there is a kind of intimacy in weakness freely allowed that no strength can ever purchase. For she let him care for her. That was the miracle of the sick room, greater in its way than the breaking of the fever. The woman who had spent a year and more needing nothing from him, who had banked down her own fires and sent on her own delicacies and gone alone into every storm, lay now too weak to lift a cup, and could not help but let him lift it. And slowly, over the long quiet days of April, as her strength crept back, the letting became less a necessity and more a gift. She let him read to her by the hour. She let him bring her the first violets from the bank below the terrace, and did not send them to the sick. She let him sit and simply hold her hand in the long afternoons and say nothing, which was a thing she had never in her life allowed anyone, having always felt she must earn her keep in any room by being useful in it. And Alaric, holding her hand in the April light, with nothing whatever being accomplished, thought he had never in all his industrious wasted life done anything half so worth the doing. It was on such an afternoon when she was strong enough to sit up against her pillows and to tease him a little, which she had lately begun to do, that he told her at last about the chapel. He had meant to wait longer. But she asked him again, as she had asked in the snow, and he had turned aside, why he had changed. And this time, with her thin hand in his and her clear eyes on his face and no county and no Sabina, and no year of cold left between them, he found he could not turn aside and did not wish to. So he told her of the wet October night, and the light in the chapel, and how he had stopped at the door meaning to go in and had not, and how he had heard her, alone believing herself unheard, praying, and here his voice failed him, and he had to stop, and she waited, very still, the color going and coming in her white face as she began to understand, and he told her that he had heard her ask God to make him happy at the cost of her own life, to keep her father though he had sold her to let her be, in some small hidden way he need never know, the means of her husband's joy though that joy were another woman, and that it had broken him open like a struck stone, and that the man who walked back to the great house that night was not the man who had walked out, and had loved her from that night, and had never once from that night stopped. She wept when he had finished, not the terrible year-long weeping of the flooded cottage, but a quieter grief, and under it he saw a kind of shame, the shame of the intensely private laid bare, and he was afraid, for a moment, that he had done wrong to tell her, had stolen from her the one holy secret thing she had kept. "You heard all of it," she whispered. "All that year I thought it was the one place I was free, the one place no one saw. I said things there I would have died before I said to any living soul, and you heard." "I heard," he said gently. "And I have carried it like something holy ever since, and I have never told a soul, and I never will. I did not tell you to shame you, Marisol. I told you because you asked me why I changed, and there is no honest answer but that one. You changed me. Not by anything you did to be seen, by the one thing you did believing yourself utterly alone. That is the truest thing anyone has ever done in my hearing, and it made me. Whatever I am now that is worth being, you made it, on your knees in the dark, asking nothing for yourself. I would be a coward and a liar to let you go on not knowing it." She was quiet a long while, turning it over, the tears drying on her thin cheeks, and then slowly something eased in her face, the shame going out of it, and a wondering peace coming in, and she said, "Then it was not wasted. All that year, I used to think when it was very hard, when I was very lonely, I used to think that at least the praying was not wasted, that even if you never knew and never softened, God knew, and it was not nothing to want your good even if wanting it changed nothing. And it turns out it changed everything. It turns out you were there, at the door, in the dark, all along." She gave a small broken laugh. "All those nights I thought I was alone with God, and my husband was outside in the rain listening, and being made new. I shall never think myself alone again." "You are not alone," he said. "You will never be alone again. I have seen to it. It is the one thing in my life I have done entirely right." And he leaned and kissed her brow, and she caught his hand and held it to her cheek, and they stayed so in the quiet April light, a long time. And it seemed to Alaric that the whole cold house of Rookhurst, and the whole cold country of his life, had been only the long dark corridor that led to this small warm sunlit room and this thin hand against his face, and that every wasted year of it had been, in the end, the price of learning to know the worth of what he now held, and that if the knowing had cost him dear, the thing known was cheap at any price, and he would not now have unpaid a farthing of it. Her father stayed a fortnight, and something in the old merchant softened toward his daughter in that fortnight, and something in Alaric softened toward the old man. And before he went, the wool merchant did the thing Alaric had bidden him do, and sat by his daughter's chair, awkward and rough and unpractised at the language of the heart, and told her, stumbling, red about the ears, unable to look at her, that she had been the best of the whole family, and worth more than the debt and the estate and his whole life, and that he had never known what to do with a child so much finer than himself, and had done the one thing he knew how to do, which was to make a good bargain, and had made, God forgive him, the worst bargain of his life in the best cause, and was sorry and proud, and loved her, and had never once said so, and said it now. And Marisol, who had spent a lifetime asking nothing of the father who had weighed her against a debt, received it, the one gift she had wanted from him and never hoped for, and forgave him wholly. In the plain, unstinting way she forgave everything. And the old man went home lighter than he had come, and wrote to her after, in his cramped merchant's hand, letters that grew, over the years, less awkward and more loving, until at the end of his life the thing that had begun as a debt discharged had become, of all his dealings, the only one he did not regret. The tenants sent their love in 100 rough humble ways all through her mending, nosegays left at the kitchen door, a carved wooden bird from the prin children whose mother had, against all likelihood, recovered under her nursing and Alaric's clumsy dozing. A letter of thanks from the whole parish that the vicar read aloud to her, and that made her cry. She had gone among them for a year expecting nothing, and now the nothing came flooding back to her tenfold, and she did not know how to bear being on the receiving end of so much love. And Alaric watched her learn to bear it, watched the woman who had never been able to learn, slowly in her 30th year, that she was beloved, and had always been, more than she had ever let herself believe, and he thought it the finest thing he had ever been privileged to witness, and counted himself the most fortunate man in the kingdom to have a hand in it. And so the winter of the flood gave way to the spring of the ball, and the ball to the long fair years that followed, and the cold house grew warm, and the great old name, which Alaric had once thought pawned and shamed by trade, was redeemed and made great again, not by any grandeur, but by the plain daily goodness of the merchant's daughter who bore it, until in the whole county there was no name so blessed as the name of the Duchess of Rookhurst, and no marriage so envied, and none who remembered, or who cared to remember, that it had begun as a debt discharged between two men across a cold library table, with the bride not once looked at, and the groom's whole heart turned to stone. They had children, in the fullness of time, though it was long feared her chest would not bear it, and Alaric, who had come to his own happiness so late, was the tenderest and most present of fathers, having resolved, in the hour of his first child's birth, that no child of his should ever wait in a cold house, to be loved as he had waited, or be weighed as a price as his wife had been weighed, and none ever was. The great chestnuts flowered every May, the tenants prospered, and the little chapel among the yews, where it had all turned, was never again a place of solitary grief, but a place the whole family loved, and where, each anniversary of their wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Rookhurst went in alone together and knelt and gave thanks, she for the husband God had, past all her hoping, given her the love of, and he for the wife whose secret prayer, overheard in the dark by a wretched undeserving man, had been the saving of his soul. He knew it before the physician did. He had watched her face for 7 days as a mariner watches the sky, and on the 7th night, a little after 2, the terrible dry heat went out of her hand, and a fine dew broke on her brow, and her breathing, the rattling, tearing breath that had frightened him for a week, eased and lengthened and grew quiet, and she slept, truly slept, for the first time since the flood. And Alaric laid his head down on the coverlet beside her hand and wept once more, from the far side of terror this time, and then he slept too, kneeling by her bed with her hand against his cheek, and the physician found them so at dawn and had not the heart to wake them. She woke fully 2 days later, thin and hollow-eyed and weak as a new lamb. The first thing she saw was her husband asleep in the chair by her bed, unshaven, gaunt, his fine coat rumpled and slept in, his hand loosely holding hers even in his sleep, and she lay and looked at him a long while before he woke, and when he woke and found her grey eyes open and clear and resting on his face, he forgot every careful thing he had meant to say and only said, brokenly, "You are awake, you are awake. Marisol, you came back. You are still here," she whispered, wonderingly, as if it were the more remarkable of the two facts. "I will always be here," he said. "I told you. In the cottage. Do you remember? Do you remember what I told you?" Colour came faintly into her white face. "I thought I was not sure whether I had dreamed it. The fever, I could not tell what was true." "It was true," he said. "All of it. Every word. Let me say it again now, when you are awake and can hold me to it. I love you, Marisol. I heard you in the chapel months ago. Ask God to make me happy, though you should never share it. And I have not had 1 hour's peace since, because you were the happiness, and I had thrown you away, and I have spent every day since trying to earn back 1 particle of what I threw away, and I do not deserve you. And I never shall. and I am asking you anyway, not as a duke, not as a debt, not as anything but a man who loves you past all sense. Will you let me be your husband? Not in truth. From this bed forward, for the whole of our lives. She was quiet for a long moment. And Alaric, who had faced down a flood and a fever and the whole county's contempt, found he was more afraid of her silence than he had been of any of them. I have loved you, she said at last, slowly, as if setting down a thing she had carried a long way, since before I knew you were worth loving. Since the day you told me on the chapel steps that you would never choose me, and I looked at your face and saw, under all the cold, that you were the loneliest creature I had ever met, lonelier even than I was, and I thought I could be kind to that. I cannot make him love me, but I can be kind to that, and perhaps kindness is a thing that does not need to be returned to be worth the giving, and so I gave it, for a year. And I asked nothing, because I had learned very young that to ask is to be refused, and I could bear anything but to have my love refused to my face. And then this winter you began to be kind back, and I could not bear it, Alaric, I could not bear the hoping. Do you understand? Your coldness I could survive. It was your kindness that nearly killed me, because it made me want, and I had spent my whole life not wanting, and I did not know how to stop once I began. You'd never stop again, he said, and lifted her thin hand and pressed his mouth to it. Want everything. Want it all, and out loud, and every day, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be equal to your wanting. Only tell me, is it yes? After everything I did to you, is it yes? It was always yes, she said. That was the whole trouble. It was always, always yes. And the Duke of Rookhurst, who had told his bride on the chapel steps that he would never choose her, gathered his wife's thin body into his arms with the greatest gentleness of his life, and kissed her softly, reverently, a first true kiss after a year and a half of marriage. And neither of them said anything for a long while, and there was nothing left in the whole world that needed saying. She mended slowly through the spring. Her chest would always be delicate now. The physician was plain about it. She would have to be cared for, guarded, kept from the cold and the sick rooms and the driving of herself past her strength. Once she would have refused all such care. Now she let it be given. It was, in its way, her hardest and her greatest surrender, not to death, which she had never feared, but to being cherished, which she had feared all her life. And Alaric understood the size of the gift and received it as such, and cherished her day upon day, with a patient tenderness that the county, which had known him only as cold and hard, would not have believed him capable of, and that his tenants, who had known him only a year and thought his change a miracle, credited entirely and rightly to her grace. He cleared her name, and did it thoroughly. He did not skulk or explain, that would only have fed the talk. He did something his rank permitted and his newfound humility made effective. He gave, at Rookhurst, the first great entertainment the house had seen since his mother died, a spring ball, to which the whole county was bidden. And he had his wife, recovered enough to stand though not to dance, on his arm before them all, in a gown not of merchant's grey, but of the palace silver-blue silk he had chosen himself, with his mother's pearls at her throat, the Rookhurst pearls, which no duchess had worn in 20 years. And he stood with her at the head of his own great staircase, and welcomed the county that had whispered against her, and let every soul in that glittering hall see, plainly and past any doubting, exactly where the Duke of Rookhurst's heart was fixed. He spoke of her openly, warmly, with a pride he made no attempt to hide. He danced with no one, because his wife could not yet dance, and he would dance with no other woman. And when, late in the evening, some brave foolish gossip ventured near the subject of certain letters, Alaric said, clearly, in a voice pitched to carry, that any letters purporting to show a present attachment between himself and any lady but his wife were forgeries got up by a jealous and disappointed woman whom he would name if pressed, and that he counted the man who repeated such a slander no friend of his house. And the subject died in that hall and in the county that night, and never rose again. Lady Sabina Merrow was not at the ball. She had not been invited, and she understood, from the omission and from all it signalled, that she had lost her second and final game. And within the year she had married a baronet in a distant county and gone away, and Rookhurst saw her no more, and Alaric, who might once have hated her, found in the end that he could not even do that. He was too happy, and a happy man makes a poor hater. He let her go and forgot her, which was the truest revenge and the one he had not planned. The chestnuts flowered along the avenue that spring as he had promised her they would, and one warm evening in May, when she was strong enough at last, he walked with her under them, slowly, her hand in the crook of his arm, the fallen blossom thick and pink on the grass around their feet, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because they had reached at last the country beyond words, where the long married live, and where a silence is not a wall but a room shared. "I used to walk here alone," she said at last, "that first year, when you were in the west wing, and I was in the east, and the whole house was cold, and I thought I should spend my whole life so. I used to walk here and look at the blossom and think it a pity that a thing so lovely should fall with no one glad of it but me. And now?" "And now," she said, and turned her clear grey eyes up to his and smiled, the whole smile at last, the one she had stifled for a year and given him only in pieces, given now entire. "And now there are two of us glad of it. And that, Alaric, I have come to think, is the whole of what it means to be happy, not to have no sorrow, only to have someone glad beside you of the same falling blossom." He stopped and turned her to him under the pink baths, and looked down a long moment into the face he had refused for a year to see, the gentle grave face with the loneliness gone out of it at last, put out not by his rank or his wealth or his great cold name, but by nothing more than his having, finally, learned to look. And he thought of the night at the chapel door, and the low unhurried voice asking God for his happiness at the cost of her own, and he understood that God, or her prayer, or love itself, had answered that prayer in the one way she had never asked for and never dreamed. That his happiness had turned out to be precisely and only her own, that she had prayed to be the hidden means of his joy, and had become instead its whole visible substance, that in asking nothing for herself she had, in the end, been given everything. "You prayed once," he said low, "for my happiness. In the chapel you did not know I heard. I remember. Your prayer was answered," he said. "You are it. You were always going to be it. I only wasted a year not knowing." And he drew her in and held her under the falling chestnut blossom in the warm May light, and over her dark head he looked at his own good fields rolling away golden in the evening, and felt, for the first time in his life,